Well, good afternoon, everybody. And we have a great audience here today that is excited and they're looking forward to learning about the faithful ministry of Jonathan Edwards. As they're taking their seat, I would like to share with you today about the faithful ministry of Jonathan Edwards. After listening to my speech, my audience will see the faithful ministry of Jonathan Edwards and to inspire in pastoral ministry. Did you know that one of the most famous and influential sermons that was preached in the English language can only be identified in 1 in 10 Americans? From beginning to end, Jonathan Edwards displayed faithful endurance in the ministry. As we examine the early, enduring, and ending years of his life and ministry, we see the years were filled with excitement, challenges, heartache, and exile. The early years. Jonathan Edwards had a spiritual pedigree. He was the son of a preacher. His father, Timothy Edwards, faithfully pastored a small congregation in East Windsor, Connecticut. His father, Timothy, was a great example of a faithful minister. Jonathan Edwards grew up watching his father's diligence and display that was necessary to complete the task in pastoral ministry. His grandfather was more famous, on the other hand. His name was Solomon Stoddard. He was the pastor of the most influential church in the western part of Massachusetts. Stoddard was labeled the Pope of the Connecticut Valley by the Mathers in Boston, a well-known theological group. Stoddard called his young grandson Jonathan to join him in his ministry as an associate pastor in Northampton. Less than 3 years later, in 1729, Solomon Stoddard passed away, leaving behind a faithful 6-decade ministry. Jonathan Edwards was elected the pastor after the passing of his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. His Election Day sermon was titled, "God Glorified in Man's Dependence." Edwards published this sermon and his fame began to grow. The Election Day sermon became famous, but nothing like the sermon that would later follow. In 1739, Edwards preached through a sermon series in Northampton on the book of Romans, chapter 4, verse 5. His sermon series was titled, and he preached on the doctrine of justification by faith alone. During the sermon series, revival broke out in Northampton. Northampton experienced revival for 6 months. 300 of the town's 1,200 residents experienced the influential power of the Holy Spirit that led to salvation in Jesus Christ. News of the revival began to spread, and also the fame of Jonathan Edwards spread from New England to Old England. Less than a year later, after the revival of Northampton, God graciously revisited his people, not only in Northampton, but in the middle and northern colonies as well for the next 6 years. During this time, Edwards preached his most famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Along with George Whitefield, the revival known as the First Great Awakening grew. Jonathan Edwards became the theologian of revival. He defended the authenticity of the Great Awakening, and Edwards would pen down many works explaining the work of God during this time. The enduring years. The challenging task of replacing a legend like Solomon Stoddard after a faithful 6-decade ministry in one church and in one town was going to be an uphill climb from the start. Solomon Stoddard was the only pastor that most of the town had ever known. With all the gifts and talent and fame of Jonathan Edwards, he could never truly replace his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, in the hearts of the congregation and town. With a great challenge in front of him, Edwards tried his best. With the flames of revival burned out, he began to address the failure of the spiritual and social tenor of the town. The revival should have changed. One of Jonathan Edwards' most famous attempts to defend the Great Awakening and encouraging Christian living, believers pointing them out that many things that mask or impostor as true conversions, mainly his topic was heightened emotion. This work was titled Religious Affections, and it was written in 1746. Jonathan Edwards argued not all professing believers are true believers. He believed there is a biblical evidence of a believer that would be judged by the fruit they bear. This belief that Edwards held on to, it challenged many in his congregation in Northampton. Which brings us to the ending years of the ministry of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards sought many ways to reform the congregation in Northampton. He sought to replace the church covenant with one that dealt with their current condition or situation. He wanted to change the church membership and the Lord's Supper that was taken and that was established by his grandfather decades before. Edwards began to see and have different beliefs of how communion and church membership should be observed and approached. Like many congregations today, this was not the way they had done things in the past. The congregation at Northampton would accept the idealism of Edwards, but would deny its application and implication in their lives personally and in the church. The congregation viewed these attempts as an assault on Stoddard's legacy. In June of 1750, the congregation voted to remove Jonathan Edwards from his position as their pastor. Only 10% of the congregation voted to retain Edwards. One of the famous quotes about Edwards during that time says that they never saw the least symptoms of displeasure of his countenance the whole week, but he appeared like a man of God whose happiness was out of reach of his enemies. Jonathan Edwards' faith remained unshakable. Edwards' final message to the congregation of Northampton was taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 14. He shared about the coming judgment and about how he and the congregation would stand before Christ and give an account of their relationship with him and with one another. Edwards' closing words, he told them that he must leave them in the hands of God and that he could no longer do anything for them but to pray for them. We find that the exile to the wilderness for Jonathan Edwards was spent in the wilderness of Massachusetts. He served as a pastor there in a small missionary outpost, and they spent their time ministering to the Native Americans. Jonathan Edwards was serving a greater kingdom need during this time. Jonathan Edwards produced some of his most famous and greatest and even important works during the 5 years that he spent in Stockbridge. The works that he produced were Freedom of the Will, Original Sin, The Nature of the True Virtue, and the End of Which God Created the World. Years later, Edwards accepted the call as the president of the College of New Jersey, which we know as today Princeton. Unfortunately, after arriving at Princeton, he received a smallpox immunization, and he eventually did contract the disease of smallpox, which then would later lead to his death a few weeks later. So in conclusion, we've examined the early years, the enduring years, and the ending years of the life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards. We have seen how faithful that Jonathan Edwards remained throughout his life and in the ministry. The life and ministry of Jonathan Edwards should inspire us to continue in the ministry that God has called us in. The last 7 to 8 years of his ministry, Jonathan Edwards produced theological works that helped launch the modern missionary movement and shape evangelism in the 19th century. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed